Welcome to Becoming a Virtual Museum, an in-conversation between me, Sam Phillips. I am editor of the Royal Academy magazine, and David Glasser, who is the executive chair of the Ben-Uri Gallery and Museum. And it should be a very interesting discussion with a fascinating museum leader and a fascinating man in himself, David. David has been leading the Ben-Uri since 2000. It's fair to say, well, it's certain to say, that as a small museum, the Ben-Uri punches far above its weight in terms of the strength of its collection, its research, its programming, and its other activities, which are of international renown. And this year, Ben-Uri is the museum partner of the London Art Fair. And if you haven't already, I implore you to see the stands. There's a display downstairs of Ben-Uri's collection, which has got some stunning art, both from the past collection and also recent acquisitions. And of course, Ben-Uri is dedicated to celebrating Jewish and immigrant contributions to British art since 1900. And it's fascinating, so please do see it. So going back to the title of this talk, Becoming a Virtual Museum, if one visits the Ben-Uri website, benuri.org, it introduces a pioneering virtual museum with a physical presence in London. The virtual museum coming first. And in a press release of 2021, Ben-Uri described launching a full-scale virtual museum as our permanent principal engagement model. And so today, while we may talk on some technical matters today, our discussion is less about search engine optimization and data analytics and website architecture. It's more a case study, really, in that shift to a digital-first model, because I think that the strategy behind it and the process behind it illuminates lots of challenges and opportunities that small museums have in Britain and also across the world. The need to innovate in order to enhance their public benefit and also to survive. And so to really understand that shift, one needs to think about this particular museum's identity, and that's an identity that reaches back to 1915. So I think we will actually begin at the beginning, and I wanted, David, could you, so people can understand that identity, could you sketch, Ben-Uri's world in the 20th century?
It should only take me about 3 years to sketch the 100 years, so we've got plenty of time. I want you to try and imagine a very different London, a London of 107 years ago, in 1915, or even 1914, which was the first year of the First World War. And I want you to try and imagine the East End, and I want you to try and imagine levels of poverty which they still probably exist in this country, but as we're the sixth largest economy in the world, they shouldn't exist in this country. And an immigrant community, a Jewish immigrant community that came from Russia, particularly at the turn of the century, to escape the pogroms, living many to a room, in abject poverty, struggling, and then a French-Russian artist, or a Russian-French artist, a Russian artist by the name of Lazar Berson, who came from Lithuania, was working with all the great names in Paris, Jewish, arrived in London, and I now talk about it in language that, of course, I have no idea what was said, but my guess is that he arrived in the East End in Whitechapel and said, "Hi guys, I'm an artist, where do we exhibit?" And given the fact that this was already the First World War had started and the men were already on the front, I guess it was received with some bemusement and said, well, look at us, we don't look as if we're ready for big exhibitions. And two, more importantly, the art establishment was in the West End of London. It was in Piccadilly, it was in Mayfair. It certainly wasn't in Whitechapel. And Berson was one of these great charismatic figures, which civilization would not be what it is today without them. And he had this vision of creating Ben-Uri as a Jewish art gallery and as a Jewish art museum in London. In the first year, the second year of World War I, in an area that was deprived of any luxuries or any comfort zones. So his vision was immense, and it was a left-wing cultural institution because the Jewish community in Whitechapel was predominantly left-wing in terms of politics and great academic interest. And Ben-Uri was founded by Lazar Berson in June 1915 in Whitechapel on the Commercial Road in a cafe. And that's how it all started. And it became the center of Jewish cultural activity for really up to the 1970s. It had its first gallery actually in 1925, opposite the British Museum in Museum Street. How we yearn for such an opportunity today, but there we go. And it was a safe house for Jewish artists, and it was an exhibiting opportunity for Jewish artists who were shunned by the establishment because they looked different, they certainly talked different, and they painted differently. Of course, there were other artists who also didn't paint in the traditional Royal Establishment way, which is why the London Group was founded around the same time. And there was a tremendous cross-fertilization between Jewish artists who were members of the Ben-Uri and the London Group, because the London Group was a much wider artistic association that actually welcomed artists who were outside the mainstream. So that's the origins of Ben-Uri. You can't dislocate art movements and artists and art society from broader society because we're part of it. So the discrimination, the anti-Semitism and discrimination against Jews and Jewish artists, if only as a result of the fact that we're Jewish, started to really disintegrate during the 70s and certainly into the 80s. So the glass ceilings that our community, because I'm happy, proud Scottish and Jewish, so, but the discrimination, the glass ceilings that restricted our community started really to lift in the 70s and the 80s. So Jews became partners and senior partners in city law firms, city accountancy firms, consultancy firms, banks and everything else. So, and it was the same within the artistic community. The Jewish artists no longer needed Ben-Uri by the time the mid-80s came, because if they were good or they were seen to be commercially attractive, there was no shortage of gallery owners to support them. So that was a big shift. Ben-Uri didn't really notice it, being really blunt. The world was changing, but Ben-Uri continued with its strategy of supporting Jewish artists in the face of discrimination. But the discrimination actually had dropped off. So therefore, the great Jewish artists of the day really became attracted to galleries rather than to Ben-Uri, as did our public, because they too became more attracted to galleries, and to the Nationals, to the Tate, the National Gallery, everything else, rather than feeling that they had to be part of Ben-Uri. It wasn't necessary anymore. And that, of course, was really the start of the decline of Ben-Uri, not because of its programming or anything else, just simply because the need for Ben-Uri started to actually really diminish. And by the time 1995 came, the building that Ben-Uri was in, which by this stage was on the 4th floor of an old synagogue building in Dean Street. And I always, whenever I visited Ben-Uri in these days, I always was grateful that it was in the 4th floor of a synagogue building, because the lift, in my opinion, was extremely unsafe, and at least that I was in a place of worship and God's house, so that I could pray that I would get up all right and I would get down slowly. But by the time the Ben-Uri, the building, the synagogue was closed, Ben-Uri lost its gallery in 1995. And there was no great level of public unrest on the streets of the museum sector or of the Jewish community in terms of how do we resurrect it, how do we save it, how do we protect it. And there's a moral in that. My corporate background is much in retail, and when Wool was closed, nobody noticed it. So if you close and nobody notices it, it means that actually whatever it was delivering was delivered elsewhere perfectly satisfactorily. So that's where we were in 1995. Should I continue?
Well, you took over
Yeah.
in 2000 then without a physical space.
Correct.
And I suppose a priority for you became to secure one.
Only after we tried to rework what actually could Ben-Uri contribute. Because if an institution is not actually contributing something meaningful, valuable, and irreplaceable, then it has no purpose. There's no reason why it should exist. So that was the first thing we actually had to do, was to identify whether Ben-Uri had a future. It had served its past well. It had perhaps outlived its past in terms of its necessity to be there. And we saw Ben-Uri collection completely differently. For us, it wasn't simply a collection of Jewish artists. What we saw was a collection of immigrant artists, because virtually all these artists, 90% of the artists in the collection, came from Poland, Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, any country you like, yes? But we didn't see them necessarily within a Jewish context. And that was a complete shift, because apart from anything else, I don't see religion and art being natural bedfellows. I see religion and art being part of each other should the artist wish to illustrate religion. But I don't see one being another. It's not, our collection is not about ceremonial art. It's about visual art. So the concept that we came up with was that given the fact that there were 250 to 300,000 Jews in the UK, spread across the whole UK, and at 2000, and we're beginning of the new millennium, when we were discussing this, we had 4 million immigrants, and we had a new century. And the real social challenge of the 21st century was then, and is still now, and will continue to be, social integration. It's about actually peoples of different colors, different ethnicities, different anything they want to be different at, actually not being different. Being self-respected and respecting each other for being human beings. And we saw this as the huge challenge of the 21st century. And here we were, as a very small community, a small immigrant community, a small minority community in the UK, with a collection that reflected mass immigration from a wide range of countries. And we just saw that as a model. We saw, if we can't use that to actually allow people to understand that, whether you came from Poland or you came from Czechoslovakia, you came from France or America, whatever it is, but your output, your delivery, your contribution to society was equal, then we're missing a trick. And that's why we shifted the whole emphasis away from being within the Jewish community, trying to provide whatever Jewish art is, and we don't recognize the word Jewish art because we don't know really what it means. We widened its radar screen, if you like, to incorporate immigrant communities from everywhere and their contribution to British visual culture, which has been immense. And that was the reshaping. And once we decided that that had merit, then we decided, how are we going to save it? How are we going to protect it?